Good evening and welcome, everybody, to the Wheeler Centre tonight. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and those who do not subscribe to arbitrary gender binaries, for our session tonight, Acting Out, Art That Changes the World. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters where we meet, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We acknowledge, myself and the Wheeler Centre acknowledge, that sovereignty was never ceded, that this always is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And we acknowledge elders, past, present and emerging from those communities, as well as any Indigenous people or First Nations people who might join us tonight. So welcome to this very exciting event. It is a co-presentation between the Wheeler Centre and the Melbourne Fringe Festival. Acting Out, Art That Changes the World, with Jax Jacki Brown, Steve Lambert, and I'm your host, Mama Alto. Thank you. So we have a tight hour today. We're going to do 45 minutes of moderated conversation Q&A panel, followed by 15 minutes of audience questions. So do try and hold your burning questions until the end, which is a bit of an ironic ask at an event about activism. But do try to hold it in just for the interests of time. And so I'm going to start off by introducing you to our wonderful panellists. Steve Lambert, give a wave, Steve, is an artist and the co-founder and co-director of the Centre for Artistic Activism. He will be presenting Capitalism Works for Me, True or False, later tonight at the Queen Victoria Night Market, and that presentation is part of Melbourne Fringe Festival this year. Thank you, Steve. Steve, if you could describe your practice in one sentence or less for the people here tonight, what would that be?
I usually, when people say, what kind of art do you make? I say, I make trouble.
I like it. All right, Jax Jacki Brown is a disability and LGBTIQ rights activist, writer, artist, performer, producer, and educator. Through their work, Jax provides a powerful insight into the reasons why it is society that needs to change rather than people with disabilities. So Jax, also in one sentence or so, to describe what you do in any way you see fit.
I provoke change. Yeah.
Promote or provoke?
Provoke.
Provoke. I
Yes.
like that. Alrighty. So we're going to start with a few questions and then we might delve deeper into the questions as we go. So I'd like to start by talking about art's potential to create change. In the title of tonight's event, we talk about art that changes the world, about art as an agent for social change, and perhaps art as a method for communicating ideas that might provoke or incite change. So in Steve's words, from the book Artist as Cultural Producer, art has the potential to reach everyday people. And Jax, in an amazing interview that you did with YWCA in Canberra, you stated that the work that you do is done, quote, because I must hope for a more just and inclusive world, and hope that my ideas and passion contribute in some small way to that. So it's clear, and I hope it's clear to everyone gathered here, otherwise this is probably the wrong event for you, that art is a platform that can have the potential to inspire, to empower, to communicate, to liberate, and to bestow agency. And that's central to both of your practices. So could you tell us a bit about your philosophies surrounding the potential of art to change the world, why that's important to your practice, and how it manifests in your practices?
I guess I'd never thought about my artistic philosophy before.
You don't think about it because you just do it, right?
Yeah, I know, and I guess I don't think about it in those terms. I mean, I've been asked about my artistic practice a lot and kind of think about what that is. And I guess because I do a lot of writing and public speaking and workshops on LGBTIQ disability rights, that's very earnest, that hopes to kind of change people's perspective of disability and get them to think about it not through stereotypes of disability, but through a human rights kind of lens. That I kind of think is that part of my arts practice? Is that artistic, even though a lot of people would say it kind of falls outside of the realms of what we would traditionally think of as an arts practice? But alongside that, I guess, I also have my spoken word performance, which I do, which is kind of my dirty queer arts practice, where I feel that hopefully I create change in people's thinking around disability, but I do so with less of a kind of earnestness to it and more of a, just that I want to get people thinking about disability and sexuality in a funny, entertaining, interesting kind of way that isn't so focused on, big ideas or intellectual ideas, but more on just me having fun and thinking about the world and thinking about the ways I move through the world in an erotic way that maybe surprises people. So I think it's really interesting for me to reflect and to think about the kind of two very separate, sometimes, elements of my art and my life and my work, and how I kind of use them differently and what spaces they enable me to take up in a different kind of way.
Would you say that perhaps the more academically inclined theory-based practice in educating and speaking in education settings that you do, that undoubtedly informs your artistic work from my experiences of your prose, of your poetry, of your online writing and your performance writing? Mm-hmm. Would there be a flow-on effect where, is it cyclical? Do your art and your academia influence each other in different ways? What could you tell us more about the relationship between them? You've identified that they exist as slightly separate things, but what are the ways in which they weave together in some circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're both really informed by a disability rights discourse, and particularly by the social model of disability, which says that much of the disadvantage that people with disabilities are subject to are not because our bodies and minds are different, but because society is inaccessible to people with differences. And so I definitely come back to that idea, both in my kind of academic life, but also in my dirty queer poetry as well, and kind of get people to start to think about the ways in which they might think about disability and how that boxes people in, and how to get to them to think about the built environment and how someone who's a wheelchair user might experience that differently. So I really feel like that politic and those big ideas that I've got through the disability rights movement and the disability arts movement really do inform both those spaces in which I work, yeah.
And before we get Steve's answers on this question, I just want to expand one more aspect of this, which is obviously accessibility is forefront in both your disability rights activism and your art. Mm. Is it ever at the forefront of your mind the ways in which an arts practice that presents activist ideas, that presents messages of social inclusion, that presents a model of socialised disability, where disability is not the problem embodied in the individual, but a problem of the way society reacts? Mm. Is it ever forefront in your mind that an arts practice that communicates those ideas is more accessible than an academic one?
Yeah, definitely. And I know that, a lot of the big ideas in the disability rights movement can be inaccessible to people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities, and that's one of the ongoing criticisms of the movement. And so I know that, starting to think about them in poetry or other kind of ways does make it more accessible and more engaging to a different kind of audience. Like, I think sometimes when I come across, when I have 20 minutes to kind of, present a lecture or training on LGBTIQ disability rights, that there's an earnestness there to that is still there, I think, in my spoken word work, but not in the same way. That I can get people to laugh, that I can get people to respond in a different way to some of the underlying ideas that perhaps makes them receptive to it in a different way than if I'm giving a talk.
And I think it is about the receptivity, if that is even a word, but the ways in which people can receive, certainly in my own practice, especially surrounding trans and LGBTI rights and social inclusion of people of colour, and certainly in Steve's work surrounding ideas of capitalism, in your most recent work, it's my feeling or instinct or belief that art is a much more comfortable, accessible, perhaps sneaky way to package these ideas in a way that is more easily responded to, more easily felt. Someone, for example, might engage with Steve's work, Capitalism Works for Me, True or False, who could never engage with the writings of Marx and Engels for various reasons of accessibility across ability, across education, across class, across dogmas or socializations that they've been raised with. So I think it's a very interesting idea that art can have a greater communicative power for social change than perhaps other forms of communication like academia or mainstream media. So Steve, do you need me to review the question before we've gotten a little bit further away but tell us about your philosophies surrounding the potential of art to change the world and how that interacts with your practice?
Yeah, there's a lot I could say here. So one thing is that art and social change, if we expand the definition of art, right? Because when art has a formality to it, and there's a training and all, you can get advanced degrees in fine art. But if we expand it to creativity, right? And we start to think about a creative life, everyone has an element of creativity in their life, right? And so we work with a lot of activists. I run a nonprofit called the Center for Artistic Activism, and we train, professional activists that are doing it as all the time, working on human rights and things like that. And they say, well, I like what you're talking about, but I am not an artist, And so we'll ask them, well, tell me about your creative side. And they'll say, well, I guess I do this work, and then every once in a while on the weekend, I have this amazing garden. And the garden is, laid out in a certain way, and I think about how you move through the garden, right? Or like I'm a DJ at parties on the weekends. And the thing about making an amazing garden or being a DJ is like you have to think about people's experience and leading them through an experience. You have to think about all these logistics and things like that too. But it's a very creative practice. And the things that would make them an amazing gardener or an amazing DJ or host a great dinner party are also what would make them a better activist, right? And that I blame a little bit the world of fine art, the commercial world of fine art, the academic side of it, but mostly collectors and wealthy people is like separating art from the rest of the culture, right? And pretending like it's an isolated, different thing that needs to be in a white room that has no distractions, that is completely isolated in every way. It's in separate spaces, right? And because art and activism have always worked together, culture and policy, you cannot change policy without changing the culture. My example I always give in the US is there's a law against jaywalking in New York. No one follows the law because the culture doesn't support it. People just cross the street whenever they want. We also have a lot of laws that are against racism, but we still have racism, right? Because the culture hasn't quite caught up in that way. And so we think of these things as isolated. There's culture, there's policy, but when you start to think about it a little bit more, they go together. They always move together. And so by changing the culture, you are changing social change. You are influencing policy. Policy is different right now in the US because changes in the culture, good and bad.
That links to another question that I'd like to jump to, but before I do, I'm interested in asking you, your work at the centre focuses, you've mentioned there's a focus there on teaching activists to engage creatively and create activism that is creative and reaches people through creativity. Have you ever considered, do you ever at the centre do the reverse? Is there an element of your practice that teaches artists how to incorporate activism into their art?
Yes, yeah. So we try to make it about 50-50. When we work with activists, we try to bring artists in because they can kind of set an example of a way of thinking, a way of responding, expand what's possible in the room as far as like conversation and perspective. But we also do the reverse. So we run programs. The most recent one, I think, was in Guinea in West Africa. We worked with a lot of theater producers that were very frustrated about corruption in the country, that sort of made plays about the corruption. But what we were saying was like, okay, you guys are doing this, let's think about how you can make work that actually changes corruption, that changes the policy, and how does the organizing work? How do you go about doing that in a really broken down step-by-step way so that you're not just saying, wow, look at this problem, it's really bad, but like, here's this problem and here's the steps that we can take to make it better, and incorporating that into the work.
Have you ever in those circumstances experienced pushback or indeed danger from conservative politicians and media outlets?
You mean like in the process of the workshop, or
just in general from the activities of the centre? When we look at the conservative and borderline fascist policies that are beginning to be enacted particularly across the Western world right now, particularly in a Trump era, has there been that kind of pushback, or have you flown under the radar thus far?
We mostly fly under the radar. When we did a workshop with artists and researchers in St. Petersburg, and we were really anxious. Like every time we went anywhere, we were telling our family at home, like, we're at this hotel now. We're at this place, just in case. But nothing happened, right? And I think part of the reason that nothing happens is because the work that we do in the end, like we do example actions with people, is that it doesn't read like politics. The people that we worked with in Guinea at the end, what they made was a very funny performance. But the performance, that's all it looked like. It didn't look like any kind of political action. It doesn't look like a march. In Skopje, Macedonia, which is another very regressive place for LGBTI people, next to Russia, one of the worst. At the time, it's gotten better actually. But the action we did was in the park, and it looked like a party in the park. But there was this, if you hung out there was a subtext, there was a message. But police will often come and they don't know how to read it, and so they just leave.
So is it a situation, we spoke with Jax just then about how often for audiences or people or, the body politic of a country or place, art makes the message more accessible. Is it a case that often art can be used as a tool to cloak the politics from regressive, conservative, authoritative, draconian powers that be?
Absolutely. And, we have some good examples that we draw on from, countries like China where protesting is outlawed. And so you have artists get together and they do this sort of strange dance performance, which I think even the police kind of know what they're doing, but China is supposed to have such a forward, face about being supportive of Chinese artists, that when it's wrapped in art, they kind of don't know what to do, right? Or they're willing to overlook it, or like I said, it's not legible as politics, and so you're able to do more. And so there are a lot of ways that creativity and artistic activism work in repressive regimes, where a straight up protest wouldn't.
Yes, and I would actually go one step further and include your country of origin and our country of origin
right.
amongst those kind of regimes that have repressive political ideas.
Fair enough.
In the way in which our art acts there. But you mentioned earlier about the white wall phenomenon of a gallery or that kind of artistic space that would render art apolitical, or that would wish to separate art from any kind of political context, life and times of artists, other movements going on. So I want to skip to, I've got a question here about history and about legacy. So artist as activist, as a concept, as something that people have done, actually has a long and storied history. despite many commentators and powers that be, including conservative politicians and conservative media, and indeed mainstream media, which pretend that this artist as activist is a relatively recent, relatively radical, and relatively unacceptable phenomenon, preferring to uphold the idea of an apolitical decorative art and preferring to separate historical examples of art activists, separate their politics and their artworks and render them decorative, lacking in context or lacking in political associations, particularly in cases where the personal is political and that has influenced the arts practice. So I would like to ask both of you, who are some of the artist activists or artists with activist leanings in their work of the past that you believe we should all know more about and engage with? And if you were offering an artist as activist 101 history, who would be the touchstones that you would recommend people look up, get to know more about and learn from?
It's a great question. I think I would ask you all to look at the disability arts movement. That was a kind of an art element to the social model of disability and the disability rights movement, particularly in the UK, that actually started to embody some of these ideas about the society being the disabling factor in people with disabilities' lives, not their bodies or minds, and actually started to think about how can we transmit some of these ideas in a political way and in an unashamed political way. And I think for many people with disabilities, being out and about, living our lives, is an activism in the sense that we're not expected to, to be happy, to be living lives that are rich, that are interesting, that are complex. I mean, I can be going to Woolies to buy my groceries and have people kind of come up to me and say how inspirational I am just because I'm buying a cucumber or whatever. Because of these notions of disability being either inspirational or terribly tragic that are perpetuated through the media. So I think for many people with disabilities, that being out and about, living our lives, is inherently an act of resistance against some of these really entrenched stereotypes that people hold. So I mean, I would suggest that people look up Jenny Morris, Laura Hershey, artists and activists, particularly from the UK, that were part of the disability rights movement and the disability arts movement that started to think about how can we trouble some of these notions of what people expect of us. And I think for many people with disabilities, sometimes just being on stage, just being in public, saying anything at all, can challenge what people are expecting you to say. I remember when I first arrived in Melbourne, I went and did some spoken word poetry, and I did this poem that was, angsty and whatever about this girl that I'd left in my country town, and it was dirty and it was queer and it was, it was a dirty queer love poem. There's a theme here, and this old guy came up to me afterwards and put his hand on my leg and said, "Oh, I know what you're going through, because I've had a hip replacement." As though everything that I had said, which was nothing to do with the wheelchair, particularly that piece, was going to be related back to this. And so I think that often puts disabled performers particularly, but people with disabilities more broadly, in a really interesting space, in that what can I say to break through some of those stereotypes that people might be holding so resolutely in their minds? Like, what outrageous, fabulous thing can I say to get them to think about it in a different way? I'm part of a performance troupe called Quipping's Disability Unleashed, and it's a bunch of queer disabled people that put on performances. And I remember once we put on a show at the Spiegel tent, and we had this family with their young kids come and sit down in the front row, and we went, oh no, because it's going to be, a bunch of queers with disabilities talking about sex all night. And so I wheeled out on stage with a rather large appendage strapped to myself because I was the MC. And they weren't expecting that. They were expecting to come and support happy, clappy disability art, right? And they obviously hadn't read the blurb. And they got up and walked out. So I think about that sometimes, and I think about how, how being provocative and how maybe getting people to get up and walk out is a sign that we've put on a really interesting and challenging show. Yeah.
And something about not playing to expectations and the way in which art gives you the ability to present complexities, to present things beyond stereotypical narratives.
Yep.
Yeah. Steve, would you like to tell us a bit about who would your touchstones be in the Artistic Activism canon, legacies and histories?
This is tough because...
Top 3.
Well, what I was going to say is this was the beginning of the research that we started doing when we started the center was, okay, well, what else has happened, right? How does it work? And, we thought, oh, okay, so Seattle at the WTO protests in 1999, there were a lot of creativity. And then we're like, all right, so 1999, let's go back further. ACT UP, they had a whole graphics wing called Grand Fury that, there were a lot of people in that movement that were in the fields of design and performance and theater and stuff, and we're incorporating that into that movement. Okay, so that gets us back to the 80s, and as we went further and further and further, we started, we eventually got to Moses, and Moses is, performing the spectacle and parting the Red Sea. And if you look at our favorite, we started doing work in the Deep South, and when you work in the Deep South, you have to address the church. And so we're like, well, all right, so if you think of Jesus as a performer and a poet, it's pretty good, and he had a pretty long influence.
Carpentry is definitely an art form, I would say, on that topic.
Right. So we started looking back at all these movements and found that, one of the tenets that we work with is that all successful activism has creativity.
And would you say that every activist movement has its associated artists? Because we can look at the civil rights movement in a US context and see associated artists, Lena Horne, Mahalia Jackson, people who went along and not only engaged with the activism by being at the marches, but incorporated that into their artwork.
Right, but I would say Rosa Parks. Right?
Rosa Parks.
So Rosa Parks is known for, what I was taught in school was that she was a tired seamstress. She was sat down on the bus. A white man came, said, I want this seat, and she's supposed to move, and she's like, no, I'm not doing it. Not today. I'm sick of this, and kicked off the Montgomery bus boycott. And all of that, to some extent, is true. But that Southern Leadership Conference, or the organization behind it, was doing was creating an image, right, and creating a story. And they rehearsed it. They used another woman before that named Claudette Colvin and tried it with her. She was younger. She was darker skinned. And she got pregnant, and it wasn't the story that worked, right? So they were like, okay, let's try this again.
So are you talking now about the idea of the sit-in across any kind of activist movement, or of the spatial intervention, or a kiss-in some LGBT contexts,
right,
as a performative act that then can be simultaneously performance and activism?
There's two things. So going back to Rosa Parks, one is a performance, right, and a story, and that story helped get that movement started. But the other thing is this famous photo of her with this white guy sitting behind her, right? And as a kid, I looked at that picture and I'm like, there's the brave woman and there's the racist white guy, right? And as we later learned in researching this, that I was like, why would he stay and sit for the picture, right? And why did they call, so this lady won't move on the bus and they're like, call the press. Nobody move. We're gonna wait till the photographer comes, right? It didn't make any sense. And the photograph, the famous photograph, is taken a year later. And she had just won a court case. And
I'll just point out, with the gasps that we experience in the audience, before the 24-hour news internet cycle, keep in mind how long a year was for information to travel worldwide.
Right. Thank you. they had won a court case, and if you think, you're about writing a news story, it's like, all right, well, we need a picture of this. Let's get a picture of you on the bus. And they took a picture of her alone, and they're like, this isn't really working. So AP reporter, jump in there. Let's get this some context.
So an early example of activists understanding the value of storytelling in artistic, creative contexts.
And image creation, right? Like creating a photo. And she knew what she was doing. She was like, yeah, I'll sit for the photo, right? Because she knew they needed that photo. And the sit-ins also were, if you look, they're wearing suits. They're wearing their Sunday best. I think Douglas McAdams described a lot of the civil rights movement as strategic dramaturgy. That Martin Luther King had a genius for strategic dramaturgy. How to set a
and
scene.
even the generation before Walter White, with his engineering of Lena Horne's career and Nina Simone's early career.
Right.
It could be. I've never thought about this, but it could be termed as dramaturgy.
Right.
Strategy management, dramaturgy, very similar things.
Yes. Yeah. And like, how do we get this in the news? How do we tell this story? How do we create characters, right? That you can empathize with? How do we show things that the racism that's happening in the dark, that's happening outside of the cameras, and have it photographed? And one of the things that was really embarrassing for the US government was fighting the Cold War, saying we're the better country, and having these pictures go around the world of, Black people being assaulted, having hoses turned on them, things like that, But all those events were it's hard. We don't have words for this. It's like it's performed. They're performed, right? They were real things, and they performed them in front of cameras so that they could be photographed, so that they could make the pictures. Someone took the picture, but they made the picture.
Yes, and going back to maybe a Butler-esque idea of all behaviour being performative, which might be beyond the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but is eminently Googleable for those of you who are interested. Something about the nature of the way in which stories and creativity is constructed and presented for messaging purposes in activism has made me think of another one of our questions that I would love to ask, and that is surrounding the multidisciplinary nature of your practices. So both of you have strongly interdisciplinary or cross-genre practices. Jax touched on this in your introductory statements about the separate nature of different things you do. Steve, your practice incorporates art, activism, sociology, magic, psychology, martial arts, design, marketing, comedy, organising, and more. Jax, yours involves art, activism, journalism, performance, prose, poetry, queer theory, education, producing, disability rights, LGBT rights, and more. Could you both briefly tell us about how you have gone about mixing and collaging those different forms and ideas, and whether you believe that a diversity of forms and genres and expertise might in fact be essential to the type of arts activism you pursue?
Yeah, I think so, and I think I've already touched on this before when I was talking about it, but I really do think so, and I think making my serious kind of activism sustainable for me is about having this funny, raunchy element to my performative, to my spoken word performance. That I think that gives me kind of a space in which I can relax, a space in which I can find the humour in the struggle. And a space in which I can feel like I'm performing to my communities and to my people. And these days I'm very selective about where I will do my spoken word stuff so that I can avoid the older white man who's just had the hip replacement kind of demographic. I choose the queer, disabled spaces that we're lucky enough to have created in Melbourne to do those more kind of raunchy works more often than not, because there is something about speaking to people who share an intersectional experience with you, a different kind of audience response, a different kind of energy in the room than I get when I'm speaking primarily to people that are outside those two kind of lived experiences, that I find is really fundamental to my sense of belonging and sense of resilience in this work, and sense of self-care as well. I think often when I feel like a solo voice in a space talking on this intersectional stuff that a lot of people haven't thought deeply on or are beginning to think about, it can be really, really challenging to do that work, and rewarding but challenging. And so finding those spaces where I feel like I'm in my community, performing or talking to them, is really important, I think, for me being able to continue to kind of go into those spaces which might be a bit more challenging and do the other kind of work.
In my experiences of arts and activism and artist as activist in my own practice, I've always felt as though there are two distinct but interacting streams in what we do. And one is educating people to change their viewpoints and perceptions, and one is empowering people or validating the lived experience of people who have those same lived experiences of marginality as us. And I think you've identified that in a really nice way, that the interdisciplinary nature of your practice allows you to do both of those things, but also do the empowering work for yourself and others, the affirming work when you need to for your own well-being, which I think is fantastic. Steve, do you want to talk a bit about how the interdisciplinary nature, how the kind of bricolage of different practices and forms and ontologies mixes together to make your arts activism practice what it is?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot of perspective on it, right? Because it's sort of, to me, just means what it is to be an artist. For me, I'm a much more outcome focused, right? And out of a sense of practicality, right? Like, so
you're focused on the end, to use a very clumsy reductive term, the end, and then you see what means are available that can get that?
Exactly, right? So I want an audience to have this kind of experience, or to have these thoughts, or in the end to behave in this way, or to do this certain thing, or be prone to do that. And so what are the ways I can make that happen? And that has led me to learn computer programming. That's led me to do a ton of research about opioid abuse, right? And tons and tons of interviews, and that kind of sociological work, or research advertising for years, right? And try to figure out how they do it, because I'm trying to get to a similar end and use different end with similar means. And so figuring out how that works.
So it's about being pragmatic in the approach and the medium so that you can reach that kind of agency and urgency that you're trying to provoke in people?
Yeah.
Would you recommend that all artist activists take that approach of an interdisciplinary mix of different forms and genres?
Well,
or is that just what works for you?
I was going to say, it's not for everyone, and good luck trying to tell artists what to do. But I have found it really helpful, right? So, and I think that going back to what I originally said, which is this isolation of the arts and stuff, that happens in the way that we're taught about who we are as artists and what we can accomplish. And so when I talk to artists and say, you can change this, they're like, no, they're really, that's actually where I get a lot of pushback, is I can just sort of reflect on this. I can talk about it. I can raise awareness and start a conversation, but actually changing it, that's a little bit outside of the scope. And then it goes to this weird place where they consider that manipulating, or kind of I don't know, it's like instrumentalizing this beautiful thing that they're trying to make, right? And so again, for some artists, it's not for them. But I want artists to make a conscious choice, right? So do you want to change this? And if you do, let's take it seriously and not minimize your power, because you are powerful as an artist in creating culture, right? And let's be honest about what we actually want to get done. So, if you do want to change a policy, let's say that, right? Let's not pretend, and say it out loud. This is what we want to do. You don't have to say it to everyone, but you at least need to say it to yourself. And what's the best way to do that? And to look at all the options. And some of it might not look like art. And I have a hard time with this myself. Like I find myself
Which
doing
is why in
things.
your initial statement you said, let's broaden our idea and not talk about art, but talk about creativity.
Yeah, for example. But being somebody that's trained in the arts, and I have this voice in my head of old teachers that are like, you need to build your portfolio. And so when I think about working with people who use drugs and trying to create safe consumption spaces for drug users in the United States, where we don't have those. You do here in Australia. Congratulations.
Well, keep an eye on the more conservative elements of our state and federal politics to make sure that continues.
Yes, yeah, I can tell you in the United States, a lot of people are dying because they don't exist. But that work, sometimes because I'm trying to be very practical about, in the end, we need to open one of these spaces. The work doesn't always look like what you would see in a museum, or even what my more radical artist friends would even consider artwork. But it's what needs to get done. And it is a creative, different approach. The lawyers that I work with are like, whoa, hey, So it's still something creative, but I have to remind myself this is what I'm actually trying to do, and that this is open to me. I don't that voice of you have to build your portfolio and what art looks like and stuff is narrowing and limiting and would cut off another avenue of us potentially getting to success.
A very pragmatic approach. So with approximately 4 minutes until audience question time, I do have 2 very important questions. I've dropped my 2 less interesting questions. We're going to see if we can barrel through them. The first one, I would just like some brief responses from both of you. Part of tonight's event description is about the idea of what is effective arts activism and what is preachy. And I always think, if we're going to look at who's preaching, artists are the last people we need to examine in our society if we're concerned about preaching, behind several mainstream media and political forces that are guilty of this in the literal and figurative sense. That's my little soapbox moment for the evening. And I would like responses, though, to the idea of preaching. I'm going to give you a stimulus quote from Tim Miller and David Ramon from their work, Preaching to the Converted. And then I'd like your views or your response to that. They wrote, "To dismiss queer performance as preaching to the converted presupposes that we, the converted, no longer need occasions, events, and rituals where members of our own communities profess and perform to us their beliefs, so that we, in the assembled crowd, can take these and incorporate their insights into our own continuing struggle to live in a deeply problematic world." So just kind of some one-sentence brief responses to this idea. What are your views on ideas surrounding relevance, urgency, agency, and preaching to the choir?
Yeah, as I said before, I think I do spend some time preaching to the converted, and that's a really important space for me to inhabit. And I remember the first time I found Quippings, a Quippings performance, and was part of that performance. It was one of the most important nights of my life because I felt like I had found a space in which my queerness and my disability were valued, were desirous, were interesting. And I didn't have to preface it with all these things. I didn't have to kind of try and push through other people's ideas of what they might mean. That I could speak in ways and know that my experiences were being understood and experienced by people in that room. So I think when you're marginalised, finding those spaces and having those conversations and finding that creativity in that space with other people is fundamentally important for you as an artist and as an individual. Yeah.
And is it about, for the audience, is it about flipping the idea that you're preaching to the choir into something that is about building and sustaining resilience in communities and building empathy across communities?
Yeah. And I think, particularly for Quippings, we get a lot of the LGBTIQ community come who may or may not be disabled. So I think it builds communities that are thinking about these things deeply and wanting to find intersectional spaces that are political as well. And I think that's really important.
briefly, Steve, your thoughts on preaching to the choir, its relevance in our society.
Yeah, I think you made a great point. And, we have a saying at the center, it's like preaching to the choir is what the church does every Sunday, and it seems to work pretty well for them.
It's kept them going for 2,000 plus years, hasn't it?
Right. It's also the sort of end part of a long process that a lot of people go through to get to a certain kind of sense of self, right? And, to use a metaphor, like if you spend a lot of effort, like to get to a party, I don't know if it's happened to you, it's happened to me, but to get to a party, you show up and then like nobody you know is there and you're just like alone in the kitchen. You don't want to come back to the next party, right? And so that like, hey, thanks for coming. It's so good to see you. That kind of stuff reinforces the behavior or the, all this work that it takes to get someone to do that action, to like show up at a protest or to show up at an action or to participate in a project. And so to say thank you to these things are also like really important supportive parts, right? And so I think that's important. And then there's a sort of side effect, right? So it's funny that you mentioned Tim Miller. I worked at this theater called the New Conservatory Theater in San Francisco when I was like 20, 21 or something. And Tim Miller was performing, and I was the house manager, so I just sat out front all the time and was bored. And Tim would come between his shows and talk to me. And, he had a totally different life experience than I did, and would ever have, right? And he was super friendly. And he's like, come see my show. Do you ever go in the shows? I was like, no, I just sit out here, And he's like, well, come see my show. And I was like, okay. And so I sat through his show. And, I'm sure there were aspects, unfortunately it's been like 20 years, so I don't remember it very well. But I know there were parts that like made sense to me, that resonated, but I know it didn't resonate to me like somebody who really identified with Tim Miller, right? And his experience. But that became like another reference point in my sense of like what is possible in the world and who is in the world, and expanded my world, right? And so even while we are preaching to the choir, there are other people that hear it, and it has these knock-on effects of like, this is normal. Here you are in a space where there are people that are different than you, that speak in this way or that talk about these things, and this is just another way that the world can be. And maybe it's, an introduction for others.
So it's interesting, especially given your work on capitalism, it's interesting that a capitalist society emphasizes, when there's any critique of economic systems, the importance of a trickle-down effect. But why don't we extend that same trickle-down logic to preaching to the converted in performance art as activism? Now, it is already gone into question time. I have one last very important question before we open to question time, so you get 1 minute each. Unfortunately, it is the most complex question of the night. Does the artist have a responsibility to engage with political context? Is all art political, and should all artists be activists? 1 minute. Jax?
Yes.
Amen. Amen to that. Steve?
Yeah. My old teacher, Malachias Montoya, had this thing, it's like all art is political and propaganda. It's just propaganda for the rich and powerful. And so you need to sort of make a choice about who you're going to make propaganda for.
Because your art will be politicized once you're gone anyway. So even if it's apoliticized, that's a political act, isn't it?
Right, yeah, there's no way around it.
Yeah. So we're going to open to speaking of preaching to the choir, we're going to open to the audience questions now and find out if we are in fact preaching to the choir or if we're about to experience some pushback. So I'm quite excited. We've got 2 microphones going around the house. We also have a request from several of the panelists, namely me and Jax particularly, but I think Steve also agreed with us, supportive. We'd like to prioritise that the first of the questions not be from a cisgender, straight, white, able-bodied, upper-class man, because in the mainstream we hear your voices a lot. So, throw up your hands or any other indication if you would like a mic to come to you for questions. We have roughly 10 minutes of questions to go. In the front here, do we have a microphone?
In the last 10 or so years, psychological research has shown there's been a great rise in narcissistic personality disorder. And in fact, the three fields that most attract people of that are politics, surprise, media, and charity of all things. Now, I've found in my own practice in theater, it has become harder and harder to get people who will cooperate on political theater because there is so much pressure to be special and to have status. And you can't really say, I find, as much anymore, there's no such thing as a small role, only a small actor. So how are you finding the ability to get people to cooperate for sincere activism to create change?
I think from a disability theatre perspective, there's often this pressure on disabled people to not stand out any more than you already do. To kind of, you may look different, you may be different in some kind of way, but let that be the only way in which you rock the boat in the world. You know, aspire to be heterosexual, to have the white picket fence, to do all the kind of normative things in life and kind of try and hide or downplay your impairment. And so I think for many disabled people, they've really internalized that. And those messages come from society, but they also often come from our family members and people closest to us. And so they don't want to then push the envelope, to rock the boat, to be seen as political, even though existing in a body or mind that is different in this world is to have a unique and different perspective and to have a political perspective, I argue. But I often end up in these really stifling spaces sometimes within the broader disability community where people really don't want to be making political work, don't want to be thinking about their identity as at all being politicised. It's just this unfortunate thing they happen to kind of live with. So that can often be really hard to kind of get people to start to think about their identities in ways that might be political and in ways that are shaped by the society in which we live.
It's a really good question, and I'll try to be quick. One, I think I'll just sort of say, I don't know if this is helpful, but like there's so much satisfaction sometimes in working behind the scenes. And if that's something that you can share and have people experience, right? Like the reward of being part of something that I mean, I think that's one of the great things about life is helping other people. Like I think that it's a big part of why we're here, right? And so if somehow you can cut through all that stuff and get back to that, it's a beautiful thing. The other thing is I kind of leverage that sense of like a little bit of the selfishness and the desire to be seen and heard in people. And so the capitalism sign works that way, right? So no matter what, you get to press this button and your vote is registered, even though it doesn't really matter, right? But they get that sense of like, I did this thing and I pressed the button and the light changed and I talked to the artist or someone heard me, no matter who they are. And so it makes them want to participate. And so by indulging a little bit in this desire to be special is a way to draw people in that I've used.
From my perspective, it's such a great question. And in so many ways, finding collaborators in the arts is fraught. But the link that you've described between narcissistic personalities and that desire to be special, for me always comes back to motivation when I'm looking for collaborators. So if someone's motivation is that they want to tell a certain story or gather a certain message, empower people from certain lived experiences, express something about what it is to be human, that's going to be a great work to work on. And I want them to work on it, or I want to work on it with them. But as you say, if their motivation is to be an overnight star or be incredibly rich off their art, they're not going to be a good collaborator to work with. So it's about it again goes back to actually this idea of preaching to the choir. It is about finding people who are in the same state as you at the same point in the journey where they want to make their art for similar reasons to you, or what I might say, make their art for the right reasons. But from a non-value judgment loaded statement, finding like-minded people who want to do that. And it is difficult, you're right, and I don't think there's an easy answer on how to find them. But it is something about finding people who operate within an artistic ecology rather than people who try and operate within an arts industry to become an instant star, or an arts economy to become mega rich, which is also a bit of a fallacy to begin with. Do we have any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes to go. Here we go, up the middle here.
Hi, I think you just mentioned an arts ecology, and that touches on what I've been studying, the creative industries. It's basically this, capitalism has taken over art and creativity.
And perhaps our whole world at
and
the
our
moment.
whole world, right? And my question is about value. It's about what matters. And obviously this is about art and activism. But how do we, if governments' agendas have been taken over by corporations and people are blindly swallowing convenience as user-generated content, as artists, how do we redefine the value of what we do for the greater public?
What a great question. Before any of us attempt to give answers to this question, I do want to name check that the ability to question these ideas with our art and to operate in arts ecologies outside of those kind of corporate systems, it is an idealist view, certainly. But if artists can't be idealists, who can? But it is an idealist and purist view, and I want to name check and acknowledge that to be the kind of artist who can make those statements and operate outside those systems often takes quite a large degree of privilege, often class privilege, often the class privilege to take the unpaid internships or to work on a certain project knowing that we have a familial safety net in case we can't eat for the next year. And that is an important consideration before we discuss these ideas about capitalism, art, arts ecologies, arts economies, value of art, financial versus social values. It's important that we, especially in a Melbourne and Australian context, I'm sure it's the same in a US context, that we check the privilege of those who are able to do that before lauding them as fearless social justice warriors. We acknowledge that they have that privilege, economic privileges that enable them to critique that same economy.
I'd love to give you like a really short, great answer that you could just leave here and get to work on. And I'll do my best. One is to really, like I was saying before, imagine the world that you want and imagine really wild success with it. You know, what Melbourne would be 10 years from now with what you hope to have, right? And to then be able to sort of describe, all right, well, this is what we could have, and to organize around the vision instead of fighting the problems, right? And this is a mistake that I've made personally, and I think happens a lot in the US, where we tend to focus on these sort of more short-term things and defending, which also needs to be done. But at the same time, like, if any, you know, like you say, if anyone can be idealistic, it's us. Like, what's the world that you want? How would the funding system work? And then describe that and always be comparing that with what we have so that people know how stark the difference is and then identify the steps that we can take to move towards it, right? I could go on. I should stop there. But
Jax, would you like to respond to this very interesting, complex question?
No, I think in the interest of time, I'll ponder the question further. Yeah.
I am going to make a brief comment on this question, actually, to do with value, to do with the idea of changing the world. I've got 20 seconds. We'll see if I can do this. In my own personal arts practice, I tend to take a more naive approach. It is idealistic and in some ways naive, but it's the only way that I can self-sustain as an artist with the messages I give without descending into hopelessness because of the crushing weight of the realities of the systemic oppressions that our world is going through. And, oh goodness, the timer is flashing red at me, so I am out of time, but very briefly. I like to follow the idea of the parable of the starfish, which is, some of you may be familiar with the story, of a person walking along the beach after the storm, and there are thousands upon thousands of starfish flopping around on the sand, dying, and the person picks up starfish one at a time and flings them back into the ocean. And someone watches them for a while and then walks up to them, and the second person says to them, "You're never going to be able to throw every starfish back into the water. Some of them are going to die. And of the ones you throw in, more than half of them get washed back by the tide. And what happens when the next storm comes?" And blah, 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 blah. And the first person replies, "I just think about the ones that I do save." So for me as an artist, the best way I think to approach the social value of social change in my work is to think if in every audience, even if there's just one person who either changes their mind and changes their prejudices based on what they experience of me as a brown, trans, LGBT, immigrant artist with disabilities, if that changes their mind or if that empowers and affirms them and gives them resilience and strength and hope and heart to go on in their own identity and lived experiences, that one is enough, just like the parable of the starfish. And I find that if I think too hard about the massive systemic prejudices and imbalances and injustices that we're trying to force to change through our arts activism, I would not be able to go on. So that's my answer to that question. I think we do have to wrap up now. I don't know if any of the panellists are happy to stick around and answer any questions with maybe some post-show mingling. That may or may not happen if there are any more questions.
I'm going to be moving over to the
You're going to be
night
moving
market,
over to the night market at Queen
which
Victoria
is just a
Market.
very short walk.
It's not that far away. It's on the tram or a walk down if you would like to attend it's the opening of Capitalism Works for Me,
Let's
True
call
or
it that.
False,
Sure.
with Melbourne Fringe and Steve Lambert. You can, of course, catch more of Jack's work online or through upcoming Quippings performances with the Quippings troupe. And I'm just all over the town like a rash, so you can find me wherever you want. And thank you all for attending art, acting out art that changes the world. I hope that it's helped you consider some viewpoints and maybe to go out and continue making art that changes the world. Thank you to our panellists, Jax Jacki Brown, Steve Lambert.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.